Welcome to HBTV, named for me, Harry Binswanger. I'm a philosopher. I advocate Ayn Rand's philosophy of objectivism. And today we're taking up a negative topic, not a positive one, God versus reason. But I'm going to approach it through a positive presentation of what reason is and why we need to look at the opposition of God to reason. Now, I'm not saying God hates reason. I'm saying there's no reason to accept the idea of a God. It's an atheist argument. It's an atheist position. It's not even an argument. It goes deeper than that. It's the atheist recognition of certain basic, unassailable facts. Now, I'm not going to begin where you think I'm going to begin. I'm going to go way deeper. Where you think I'm going to begin is, well, let's look at the arguments for the existence of God, or let's look at contradictions in the idea of God. But I'm not. I'm going to start by asking, why do we have a concept reason? Ayn Rand had this tremendously powerful question that she used to direct her own thinking. It was, what facts of reality give rise to the need for this concept, or this idea, or this whole discussion? So you can't just take things as handed to you. Well, there's a traditional dispute about the existence of God and another one about transfinite numbers, and we just plunge in and look at it. There's a reason why we have the concept reason. And what is that? Well, there's a prior concept, there's several of them, and that concept is know, K-N-O-W, knowledge, for the verb, but it's essentially an action, knowing. Knowing is an achievement. We know things. Other things we didn't know until a certain time, then we learned them. How? How do we come to possess knowledge rather than remain ignorant? Well, we do certain things, and those things have come to be called reason, the faculty of reason. Knowledge, Ayn Rand defines as a mental grasp of a fact or facts of reality, grasped by a process of observation, grasped by observation, or by process of reason based upon observation. And that names the two means of knowledge that we have. So you get the setup here. You want to get something. It's not money in this case. You want to find an answer. You want to answer the question, what is this? We're going to be discussing, is there a God? We want an answer. We want to know. How do we know? Well, you have to do certain things. You can't just put your hands on your temples and come out with knowledge. You have to begin with sensory observation. All knowledge begins with sensory observation. For the first year or so of life, you're not capable of doing anything other than sensory observation, but you're learning and you're laying the base for higher processes based on observation. The first higher process is conceptualization, climaxing in a definition of a concept that you form. So you see lots of cookies, you learn the word cookie, and you learn what it means. You abstract from all the individual cookies and form, as a one-year-old, the word cookie. So even if you can't yet speak, if your mother says to you, do you want a cookie? You perk up. And it's not just association, because we go on to create higher abstractions that have no basis for association, like nutrition would be a very abstract concept beyond cookie, but in the same general line. Food is in between the two. So there are concepts that you form of different degrees of abstraction from what you observe. Not tranda. What is tranda? I don't know. I haven't observed anything that gave rise to my using that term. It's the words that words are meaningful if they name something that you have observed or are based upon something that you observed. You've never observed nutrition. You've observed eating. You've observed instances of food going into the mouth. You've observed hunger being quelled in yourself and gaining energy from it, but you've never observed nutrition. So it's not just an association like a dog. I had a dog that I used to take to a restaurant, and if I said to the dog, "You want to go to Moriarty's?" The little poodle would get all excited and run to the door and then run back and look at me again. That's an association of certain memories that she had formed with the sound of a word. But that's not what human concepts are. They're abstractions that stand for incalculable number of concretes about which you know things that are in common. So you know that Moriarty's was a restaurant and that their other restaurants are very different, that they're businesses that sell food to make money. You know what money is, you know the types of money, you know the role of government in money today. And so there's a vast number of abstract ideas that you build up in a network, but it all rests on observation, sensory observation. Not just because you were 1 year, for the first year you didn't have concepts yet, presumably. Certainly not in the first week, but because there's no contact with reality ultimately other than the senses. There aren't any Platonic forms. Plato had this idea that there was a kind of heaven with ideal things in it, like the ideal circle, the ideal man, the ideal instance of justice, and that we commune with these, but it's all BS. The only way you can contact reality and come to know is by starting with what you perceive, starting with observation and putting together things that are similar and separating them from things that are different using a word. Eventually, you're able to give a definition, which is to say what it is, what nutrition is, what food is, what transfinite numbers are supposed to be. So from the simplest things like table or food to the most difficult concepts, it's all a process of building on your contact with reality, or else it's severed from reality and you're just spouting words. 'Twas brilliant to slide thee toves did gyre and gimble in the wave. Jabberwocky. Yeah, there are sounds there, but there's no meaning because none of them is connected to perceptual reality. Okay, so observation is the base. The second step is observing similarities and differences and organizing what you perceive, then giving a name to it, a word, to hold that awareness of the things that are similar as opposed to things that are different. And then eventually coming to name what it is about them that makes them appear to be similar, or if they're beyond the perceptual level, what about them going back to the perceptual level makes you classify them together. So that the arch example, the last point about a really abstract concept is organism. Organism. It's embraces single-celled organisms, trees, tubers, human beings, pigs, sponges, mold. It incidentally does not include viruses. They are not living organisms. And I could show you that by going into the definition, but it does include bacteria, germs. They are living organisms. So that is something that's not perceptually available to you, organism. You cannot look at mold and a horse and say, oh yeah, well, they look very similar. It's just association. I just associate the two together. Or a clam and a tree. They don't look like they have anything to do with each other. But on a very abstract level, as opposed to inanimate matter, as opposed to rivers and clouds and rocks and planets and stars, they do have something in common. They're capable of self-generated action. They perform processes of metabolism, and they reproduce. So it's all based on perception, but it isn't just a word attached to an image, to a memory image of a perception. Some philosophers that claimed that it was that. Then finally, the last stage is combining ideas into new ideas through a process of logic. So the syllogism, for instance, the team that wins the American League championship will enter the World Series. The Astros may win the American League championship, so the Astros may enter the World Series. I wanted to vary it from the traditional one, which bores everyone's all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is immortal. So we take our clue from American baseball. So logic is where propositions using ideas are combined to reach a new conclusion. It's not just syllogisms, it's also inductive logic. But what both of them have in common is that you combine earlier propositional knowledge, that is knowledge stating what the relation of concepts are to each other, like Socrates is a man, and coming up with a different proposition as the conclusion. Socrates is mortal because all men are. So it's a combining. It's all kind of combining. It's all an integration process. You integrate observations into concepts. You integrate concepts into propositions. Socrates is mortal. Now, Socrates is a proper name. All men are mortal. Men, mortal. You combine them, integrate them, and you combine propositions to get a conclusion, which is a new proposition you didn't know before. Socrates will die. Actually, he already did, if I recall correctly. Now, most of the argument, when I say most, that's an understatement. Almost everything ever written or said about the topic of God is jumped in on the logic stage, the last stage of combining propositions to then either get the conclusion God exists or God doesn't exist. But we're going to begin on a much deeper level because God's against reason all across the board. So let's look at the God observations. That is, what are the observational facts that give rise to the existence of belief in a God? Now, when I started to prepare this, I thought, well, there aren't any. No, but there are. There are some observations that give rise to a belief in God. Not too well, doesn't actually grant it, but they're the impetus for it. Extrapolation from ourselves. We know when we get angry, particularly primitive people, when they get angry, they get violent and they may strike someone. We see a lightning bolt come down and strike someone. Probably never saw that, but they saw the results of it. Hit a tree, they project somebody is angry with that person or that tree that was struck. The only idea of causation that the primitive man has is his own. When I get sad, I cry. The clouds seem to be crying when there's rain, so the cloud god or the god in the sky is crying. That's what rain is. So one observation that plays into, doesn't justify, but plays into the existence of a God is you know about yourself and you see external events in a very primitive concept. You model them after what you observe about your own actions, that they have reasons. The reasons are desires for certain things to happen, and you bring them about to achieve those desires. So when the earthquake comes, Poseidon is shaking the ground with his staff, his trident. You know the kind of myths that primitive people have. And in general, the other observation is nature is powerful. That is, there are things out there that are gigantic and awesome. There are earthquakes, there are volcanic eruptions, there's torrential rains, there's lightning. Have you ever been near a lightning bolt hitting something? It's very impressive, scary stuff, right? So the power of natural events, particularly weather events, impresses primitive man because he's helpless before them. And that's an observation that feeds into the belief in a God who wants this to happen. Then there's the idea of, well, look how things happen. The caterpillar spins a cocoon and comes out a butterfly. What's the deal with that? The human eye is designed like a little camera. Surely there must be a designer. If I found a watch on the road, I wouldn't think that the parts just came together of their own. I would think somebody made this watch, he designed it. So the argument from design is based upon the observation that organisms, it's really about organisms. Organisms are adapted to survive in the environments that they do, and they have very elaborate, coordinated series of actions that result in them being able to survive. So the facts of the adaptation of animals are observed. Those are sensory facts. Sensory observed facts. Another one which is of a different order. You see bad people getting away with stuff. Here's a cheat, here's a bully, and we have to think of it in the primitive, context. Here's Genghis Khan. Of course, he's not so primitive, but the tribal chief has plunged a knife into somebody's chest, and it was my son, and he shouldn't have done that. It's unjust, it's unfair. The other tribe is invading us, it's unjust. We didn't do anything to them. Of course, they don't really have that kind of reasoning, but the general observation that immorality seems to pay leads people to wish for a kind of cosmic retribution, and this is familiar to people, today. I believe that there's an ultimate payment for sin. Maybe not in this world, but you're not going to get away with it in the next world. God is keeping the ledger. So the idea of somebody who's going to set right the wrongs of this world in another world, it's an observation which feeds into the belief in God. So it's not just that people wake up one morning and think, no, there's probably a invisible spirit in the sky. No, there are things that lead primitive men to hypothesize gods for almost everything. Then it gets a little bit more sophisticated, and you get to a monotheistic religion where it's become clear there aren't really gods in everything, but the God retreats and becomes more abstract, and he's everywhere and nowhere, and you can't pin him down. And in fact, that's one of the big arguments that Ayn Rand had against the existence of God. The fact that it's become what they call negative theology. Belief in God has become a belief in something that's defined only by negatives. You can't say what God is, because that would be limiting him. If you said that God is a redhead, then he's not a blonde. He's not, if he's a man, he's not a woman. If he's here, he's not there. If he's A, he's not non-A. And we can't limit God. The theologians have come to believe that's impertinent on that part. So God is everything, and that means he's nothing. Here's a quote from Atlas Shrugged. What identity are they able to give to their superior realm? They keep telling you what it is not, but never tell you what it is. All their identifications consist of nothing of negating. All their identifications consist of negating. God is that which no human mind can know, they say, and proceed to demand that you consider it knowledge. God is non-man. Heaven is non-earth. Soul is non-body. Virtue is non-profit. A is non-A. Perception is non-sensory. Knowledge is non-reason. Their definitions are not acts of defining, but of wiping out. Now, that's the most fundamental and powerful attack or expose of the concept of God. It doesn't mean anything. It's just saying, well, you know how you are? This guy is better. This guy and this guy. You know how you see a tree? Well, you can't see God. You know how you and the dog and the horse and the pig look at things and sniff things? Well, God knows without doing any of that. He has no body, he has no sense organs, but he knows everything. And if you ask a religious person for a definition of God, they'll take one of two tracks. So either say he can't be defined, or they will define him in incoherent ways. Like, I think it was George Santayana defined God as the ground of our being. Oh yeah, I'm signing up for that. The ground of our being. The theologians or amateur theologians who would attempt to define God would do it through concepts that are negations, like omnipotence. God is all powerful. There's nothing he can't do. Well, that means he violates the law of cause and effect. That means he's not an entity acting according to his nature, which is what causality is. He's everything and nothing. He's not limited in his potentials. He's got all potentials. So he is anti-causality because causality is actualization of the potentials inherent in the attributes of a limited thing that has certain attributes and can do certain things and not others. To be able to roll, the thing has to be round, spherical. To be able to tumble, it has to have edges. Well, God can both be round and not round at the same time. He's contradictory. So if you press theologians with contradictions like God is all powerful and all good, right? Why is there evil? Why are there natural disasters? Why did COVID come and wipe out all these innocent people? Why are there earthquakes? Why did the evil people seem to get away with it? Why does he allow evil? Why did he have to pay off the devil by sending it in this variant, narrow variant called Christianity of mysticism? Why did he have to torture his son on the cross to pay for something? Pay who? The devil? That was the idea. The blood money, the ransom that the devil held. Well, why does an omnipotent, all good being have to pay blackmail? And of course, these things, they've said, well, it's a mystery. It's beyond your mind to understand. But apparently not beyond the mind of the guy who says that. So there's a contradiction in saying, well, God is beyond reason. Reason is very good in its place, but there are things beyond reason. Oh, really? How do you know that? Well, I can prove it. You prove it in reason? Oh, well, I have faith in that. Well, faith means you pretend? Because that's what faith is. It's just pretending. It's not like there's some separate faculty, the faculty of faith. Good. It's just right on schedule because I've now given the argument that God is not above human reason. It's an imaginary thing beneath human reason, below. Doesn't get up to the level of reason. It's blind belief instead of working to find out an answer. If lightning strikes, investigate the nature of lightning. If evil seems to prosper, find out what's letting it prosper. Find out if your definition of evil is right. Every question has an answer in reason. Finally, we get to the more familiar territory of the logic of the arguments for God. That is the deductive or inductive arguments that take certain ideas, certain thoughts, and combine them to come up with a conclusion, just like you do in Euclid's geometry. If you've got a right angle triangle, you can prove that the angles of the two legs formed with the hypotenuse are equal to 90 degrees because you first proved that the angle sum of any triangle is 180 and you've used up 90 in having the right angle. So that what's left, 180 minus 90 is 90, or the Pythagorean theorem. So there are proofs, right, and disproofs. So what are the logical arguments if we were to accept that this concept is even meaningful, which I'm not going to do? What are the arguments people put forward? Well, why? I just said I'm not going to do it. Yeah, but what I'm going to do is, we know that this this being is an imagined negative concept made up by primitive men out of imagination because they didn't have explanations of what they observed. But it's interesting to look at how these people try to prove God. So I'm going into it not because I think, oh, well, maybe there's one that goes through, or I need to show that none of them do. I'm going through it as a window into how irrational the thinking is of the believers. I used to teach introductory philosophy, and I used a textbook that listed every single argument that had ever been given for God and analyzed it. Now, there were 33. The textbook, now you can't get it easily. It's called Primary Philosophy by Michael Scriven. And that's just one section of it. That's about 4 topics. But the 33, I read through every one of them. Most of them are utter garbage. I remember a consensu gentium from the consensus of people. That argument is, well, everybody believes in God. Sounds a lot more impressive in Latin, doesn't it? A consensu gentium. But that's all it is. Well, everybody's always believed in God. I mean, you couldn't find a culture where they didn't believe in God. Not yet. But what does that show? Well, nothing. But there are 2 arguments that go to those observations that I mentioned that are worth discussing to see what's going on. And they are the first cause argument and the argument from design. Now, the first cause argument has relatives. They all come down to the same thing. Look, you believe in cause and effect, don't you? Every cause brings an effect. Every effect has a cause. Yeah. Well, if every event is only an effect of some preceding event, what causes the whole thing? That must be the first cause. That must be an uncaused cause, because an infinite regress of this happened because that happened and that happened because the earlier thing happened and still, that is all hypothetical. That would never get started until you've explained the first cause. And that first cause is an uncaused cause. It sets everything in motion. I think it did it by saying, let there be light. Well, we call that first cause God. No, you don't. You just tricked up this argument because you want to believe in God. But let's look at the argument. In saying that everything has a cause and is the effect of another cause, you are not saying the totality of things has a cause. It doesn't. You're saying each thing has a cause, which is some earlier thing. Like each person has a parent who was the effect of earlier parents, who was effect of earlier parents, and so on, until we get back to the evolution of man from the monkey, the ape, actually. And that goes back, to the one-celled organism, and that goes back to things we don't really know yet, although there are theories about it, having to do with self-replicating systems, which are not yet alive. So it's not that you don't know where you came from until you know where the first amoeba came from. Each occurrence is fully explained by the causes of it. You don't need a cause of the totality. Nor would the first cause be an explanation. Well, there must have been a first cause. Oh yeah, what caused that? Well, that's God, and God always existed. But wait a minute, Your whole argument is there has to be a cause to explain what exists. There can't be something that always existed. That's your argument. If you thought otherwise, you would say, well, the universe always existed. But that doesn't sit well with them. No. The universe has to be explained. But God doesn't have to be explained. God is the uncaused cause. Now, why are they satisfied to rest in God? Why don't they say, well, there must have been a super God to create God and a super duper God to create the super God? Why does that argument not impress them? Why are they, oh no, God's different. God is a pure spirit who created the world out of a wish. Because God is a consciousness in their view. If there's anything that religionists at least agree upon, is that we're not talking about some impersonal force of nature. We're talking about a spirit, a mind, somewhat like our own, but very different. But God is aware. If it's a God who's not aware, that has nothing to do with the concept of God, and you're back to nature. So they're happy to rest once you've traced events back to somebody's wish or some great consciousness's wish, which is the ultimate reversal. Because really, consciousness is the faculty of observing that which exists. Consciousness is secondary. What exists is primary. To be conscious is to be conscious of something. So that something that you're conscious of, or God is conscious of, has to exist in order for it or him or you to be conscious. Ayn Rand terms that the primacy of existence over consciousness. But religion is based on the primacy of consciousness over existence, that having something in a mind that has nothing to be aware of. In the beginning, there was nothing, and darkness was on the face of the void. So what was God attending to? Well, himself. Well, what was himself? Well, it was his attention to himself. And what was himself? Oh, it was his attention to awareness of, his awareness of, his awareness of, his attention to his, so you can never stop. It's an incoherent doctrine. Consciousness is like, say, tasting. You can't say that's a form of consciousness. God, in the beginning, God tasted. Tasted what? There was nothing, right? So there was no tasting if there was nothing to be tasted. In the beginning, God thought. Thought about what? Thought about his thinking. Thought about his thinking about what? Before you can be conscious, there has to be something for you to be conscious of. So that is that's almost exact paraphrase of Galt's speech in Atlas Shrugged. But you don't need any authority to grasp that. It's obvious that you can't talk about seeing but seeing nothing, thinking but thinking nothing, imagining but imagining nothing, even dreaming or hallucinating. I was dreaming, I was hallucinating. About what? Nothing. I had this amazing dream. What was it about? Nothing. You mean nothing of any importance? No, there wasn't any content to it at all. That's not what dreaming is. It's not, and consciousness is an umbrella term for seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, imagining, remembering, thinking, deducing, defining. All of those things have objects. Consciousness is a relation to an object. So there can't be a consciousness without existence, but it makes sense to the religionists because they imagine that some external consciousness is not theirs, is all powerful and doesn't need anybody. Well, I won't tell you the Bob Newhart line that comes to mind on this, maybe in the question period. God doesn't need no stinking object. That's not the line. He's consciousness without anything to be conscious of. And that sounds good to people who are afraid of other people's consciousnesses. They're focused on what are they thinking? What are they saying about me? They're focused on getting the approval of and impressing and defeating, deceiving maybe the consciousness of others, as if the consciousness of others ruled the universe. So it makes sense to them, to that kind of mentality, that the universe is ruled by a super big consciousness. But the joke's on them. You can't be conscious if there's nothing to be conscious of. The argument from design is the other big argument. So we first had the first cause argument, must be in first cause, a pure mind that you can trace everything back to, and it's eternal. No, everything, including what's in mind, traces back to existence, the universe, and it's eternal. The argument from design is, well, look at the marvelous adaptation of organisms to their environment. And I think we all know the answer to that. Evolution under natural selection. Any organisms that are not adapted to their environment don't live to reproduce. Any organism that's a little better equipped than its competitors to survive and reproduce does so at their expense. So it proliferates. And that's, I won't rehearse the argument, but that evolution by natural selection is well known to be the answer. And anything if you want to bring up in the question, well, what about the argument from a million monkeys and a million typewriters? It's very easy to handle. So design, yeah, there is impressive organization of things to fit their environment, of living things, not of rocks. You wouldn't say, boy, that rock is really adapted to what? To being a rock, to sinking in water, to what? It's not, the concept doesn't make any sense. So it's the alleged design is the adaptation of organisms to their environments that Darwin explained 100 years ago, 130, 40 years ago, around the American Civil War time. There are two more fun arguments that I'll take up after the big conclusion here, if there's time. But that is the reason, to the extent that people have anything approaching a reason and an argument for this being that they can't define except by negatives, the closest to an actual argument are first cause and design, and it didn't take much to answer them, which tells you something. That leaves people with, yeah, well, you can't prove there isn't a God. Right? So the atheist is just as much a man of faith as the religionist. I don't think so. The religionist, having no reason but wanting to believe, pretends and calls it faith that there is a God. The atheist, having no reason and realizing that, doesn't believe, doesn't pretend, and faces facts. That is not a form of pretense. To not pretend is not a way of pretending. There's a principle of logic that the burden of proof is on the person who makes the assertion. And this takes us all the way back to our beginning. What facts of reality give rise to the concept of need for the concept of reason? It's the fact that you have to work to gain knowledge. Gaining knowledge is an achievement, and there's certain ways to do it. You observe, you put your observations together, you test your results, you integrate it with other things you know, check for contradictions. You define it so you make sure you know what you're talking about. If you don't do that, you aren't in contact with reality. You're playing a game of let's pretend, of imagination. So Scriven calls this, well, you can't prove there isn't a God, the Santa Claus argument. Because you could say, well, you can't prove there isn't a Santa Claus. I say, well, wait a minute, nobody on a sleigh could go around the earth in one night and distribute all the gifts. Well, this is a special spiritual sleigh with powers that we don't even know about. Well, how does he know what every little boy and girl wants? How does he possibly have all that knowledge? Well, it's by some non-human means. Yeah, you and I couldn't do it, but Santa Claus has a way. You've got to have faith. Can you prove there isn't a Santa Claus? Well, I tried, but you made up things that protected your theory. Yeah. Once imagination is allowed the status of fact, you can't prove or disprove anything. I am the reincarnation of Genghis Khan. Can you prove I'm not? Well, yeah, you're not Chinese. Well, reincarnation isn't of the body, it's of the soul. Well, it doesn't matter what you say, they can make up something. If making up is allowed, you can't use logic. Now, it occurred to me just today, there's a metaphor that's helpful, or an analogy that's helpful in dealing with this Santa Claus argument. Well, you can't prove there isn't. And it's that the absence of a ceiling is not a ladder. The absence of a ceiling, meaning you can't go up past the ceiling because the ceiling's a barrier there. And that's what a refutation would be, or a disproof. The fact that there's no ceiling there doesn't mean you have a way of getting up to a height. The only way to get up to a height is to obey the laws of physics and build a ladder or some other conveyance that will take you up there. It's not just the absence of a prohibition against it that is going to lift you. In the same way, the absence of a disproof here, because there can't be a disproof of something defined just as non-A, but be that as it may, the absence of a disproof is not required to refuse to believe something. To believe is to say, I know this. You know, you can't say, well, I have my beliefs. You have your claims to know. Even if it, well, I'm not saying I know with certainty, but I know with probability. Well, you're claiming to know that. Any claim to knowledge, any knowledge has to be based on observation and a certain process of figuring things out. Where's your process? Well, I have faith. In other words, you don't have a process. You don't have any way of knowing it, what you claim to know. So it's just prattle on your part. It's just meaningless verbiage. So no, there's no responsibility to refute something that cannot be defined and for which no evidence, sensory or logical, has been provided. Statements without grounds are called arbitrary. They're arbitrary. That's separate from true and false. Truth is a recognition of reality. False is that which you understand and contradicts what you observe in reality. But the arbitrary is what is just spouted out without grounds, without reasons, and it's cognitively worthless. It's not knowledge. It's not the first step towards knowledge. It's just hot air. And it doesn't need refuting. Things don't need refuting. They need supporting. And if there's no support, it's been better than refuted. It can be dismissed as arbitrary. Okay, that aside from the two fun arguments, that is the end of the serious part. So let's see what's in the question chat. Nikos?
Okay.
Or is it
Okay, so we
Dylan?
have quite a few questions here.
Mm-hmm.
We can
Good.
start with some of the relevant ones. Liberty Llama asks, what do you think about the view of God in a creation from material understanding? One where everything that exists has always existed, including men.
Including what?
Including men.
Nin?
Men. M-E-N.
Oh,
Man.
men. That's a Southern accent talking here, including men. Well, we know men didn't always exist. Aristotle, had a good excuse. He was writing 300 to 400 BC. And he and a lot of other Greek thinkers thought the species were eternal, just like matter is eternal. But we know that that's not true. I mean, there's the scientific record of the emergence of different species is incontrovertible. So we know that is in fact false. So there's nothing to discuss. Let's take the next question.
Yep. Joe asked, did Ran ever share with you her argument? Incidentally, I know some very good arguments of my own in favor of the existence of God, but they're not the ones I've read in any religion.
No, and I'm sure she didn't hold that by the time she wrote that in the 40s. But I'm sure she did, reasonably sure that she didn't have that position by the middle of the 50s, let alone in the late 70s when I knew her well enough to have asked her if I had known she ever said that. So no, I can't imagine. So I have to pass on that. It is a very jaw-dropping statement. Now, she doesn't say those arguments would prove anything. She just says she's come up with a better argument that the religionists could make, but it wouldn't change her mind. She was an atheist since age 13. Next question.
Okay, so that's our questions on God.
Oh, well then, before we take non-God questions or profane questions, let's take those two fun arguments. They're Pascal's wager and the ontological argument. I'll take Pascal's wager first because it's easier. Most people have heard of it. Frenchman, I think the early 1900s, Blaise Pascal, said, either there is a God or there isn't. I don't know, but if I believe there isn't and there is, I'll be damned to eternal torment in hell. So whatever the probability is, let's say there's only a 1 in a million chance that there is a God, that's outweighed by the pain I'm going to feel in hell forever. On the other hand, if there isn't a God, but I act as if there is, and say I believe, what have I lost? Very little. I mean, what if I even go to church on Sundays? Okay. I mean, I'd rather be, what did Frenchmen do in the 1800s? Drinking wine somewhere. But it's a small price to pay, a small negative for a small chance that there is a God, but it's way outweighed by this infinite horror that will happen if there is a God and I didn't go to church or believe him. So it's a good bet. It's a good bet. If you can lose an infinite amount by making one bet and have virtually no losses if you small finite for your lifespan. If there isn't a God, and he did the other two possibilities too. Like, I believe in there is a God, I got infinite reward. I don't believe and there isn't a God, well, there's nothing. right? I mean, I don't go to heaven or hell. It's all over when it's over. There's no reward or penalty to that. So I wanted to draw a cartoon. This is a pragmatic argument, right? That you better act like there is a God on the chance that there is one. And he'll be pissed if you don't believe in him. The cartoon would be St. Peter at the gate, the pearly gates, with a scroll, of names trailing off to infinity. And there's a Frenchman all decked out in the, the finery of France at that time. And St. Peter is saying, you lose. Meaning what? If you think about it. Meaning there's absolutely no reason to think that if there is a God, what he's going to do about how you live your life. Let's say there is a God. Does he want you to believe in him? Oh, yeah, of course he will. Why? Well, you're disrespecting him if you're not believing in him. Not really. But why does he care about your disrespect? Is he that touchy? Is he a neurotic? Nobody's dissing me around here. I'm going to send you. I thought when I was 15, if there is a God, he'd want us to live as atheists. Because God is supposed to be a loving father. And what kind of father would raise you to be a supplicant to him, spend your time praising him, deny your own life, live in misery in order to glorify him? What kind of father? That wouldn't be a godly father. That'd be a sick, perverted father. So if you believe, I said, if there is a God, he would want us to go ahead and use the faculties that he gave us, just like an earthly father would, and live our lives and forget about him. Maybe call on Sundays, a phone call, but you can't phone God. The deeper philosophical point is you can't make calculations of the irrational. If you say, well, there's no real reason to think what's in the Bible is true, it's just what's been handed down from people who claim they got it from some voice that spoke to them or something. But we don't even, if you trace it back, it's farthest we can trace back these writings is to church synods of the 3rd century, I think it is. But I mean, I'm granting too much by even saying that. No invisible spirit in the sky spoke to Moses or drew with his finger in the stone tablets. That's obviously just a myth made up to entertain and frighten people. It's not rational to believe that the Bible has any connection to reality at all. So why believe that if you disbelieve in God, you'll be punished? Why not believe you'll be rewarded infinitely? And on the final hand, I've got many hands, like Shiva, the god, the Indian god. On the final hand, what do you lose if there isn't a God and you act as if there is? You lose your only life. The only life you have then is spent lying to an imagined supreme being. Oh yeah, I believe you. I'm going through the motions. I mean, you don't think God wouldn't look down if he was the God like Pascal imagines him to be? Wouldn't he look down and say, "You're faking it, Pascal. You just don't want to go to hell, and that's why you don't believe in me. You're just hedging your bets. You're going to hell." So once you say there's something beyond reason, now you can't ask, well, what's the rational bet to take about this thing beyond reason? So Pascal's wager is a gigantic fraud, or a cheap fraud. It's not even that gigantic. The other one, I'll tell you what it is, but we don't have time to go into its full glory. The ontological argument. made up by St. Anselm in about 1100 AD. Imagine that there is a being who's the greatest conceivable being. He lacks nothing. He's perfect, he's full, he's got everything. Imagine, just, I'm not saying there is, but just imagine. You have that idea, right? The greatest possible being. Well, if he doesn't exist, then he's not the greatest, because a God, a being like this, who had those attributes and existed, would be greater than the one that didn't exist. So by the very fact that I have the idea of a greatest possible being that lacks nothing, it can't lack existence. It has to exist. Now, there's a million things wrong with that, but I came up with the one that's like better than anything anybody's ever said about it, to my knowledge. And I'm familiar with the usual critiques. And that is to imagine something as existing. So the step that's one of the illegitimate steps is imagine X. Now imagine that this imaginary X doesn't exist. You can't imagine to exist something that doesn't exist. To imagine X is to say, well, let me now suspend what I know and picture there being an X. And then they say, well, compare this X, which is imaginary, to an X which is real. But an imaginary X is real qua imagined. So they're asking you to step in and out of the supposition. Suppose there's a God. Well, if he didn't exist, he wouldn't be as good as a God that did exist. But you suppose he exists. So that gets to the nature of consciousness and imagination versus reason, which is kind of where we began. I don't want to, since you're at our end, I don't want to take, Dylan, questions that are not on God and religion, but are there any others that are on God and religion?
No, that is it. Other than a personal question relating to your time in religion, it's from Michael. He asked, did your family cut contact with you after you walked away from religion?
Did my family cut contact with me after I walked away from religion? No. My father died about the time I did. I had a very interesting conversation with my father about it. I guess we can take a little time for personal story. My mother lived until I was 23. I became an atheist at 15, 16, 17. My father died when I was 15, but my mother died when I was 23. They were a lot older than me. And the health conditions weren't so good back then when they were growing up. I was raised in the Jewish religion. I was never really in it, but it was what my parents believed. And so I thought, well, I'll go along with this and find out what I believe when I get old enough. And by the time I was 15, I had reached this position, if there is a God, he wanted us to live as atheists. And we were Reformed Jews. I say we, they were Reformed Jews. And they were taking me to the temple for our confirmation, which is like a Reformed Jewish idea of bar mitzvah. It's very much more secular, less religious than a bar mitzvah. You don't have to learn Hebrew. But they give presents for it, just like for the bar mitzvah. And it's a big deal. And I was on the way to be confirmed in the final ceremony when I was 14 or 15. And my father said, this is a very important day. And I said, I don't think so. And he said, what do you mean? And I said, well, I don't believe in God. And he was driving the car and he put his foot on the brake and the car slows down. And he says, if that's true, will stop right here. And I'm thinking, wow, is that all I had to say to get out of this horrible crap of going to temple? That's wonderful. I didn't say that. It was like one beat. But he saw that my reaction was looming delight, getting ready to be delight and celebrate. And he said, and you can give back all the presents. Instantly, that meant to me, oh, he's trying to bribe me. That means he's not really concerned with whether I believe inside. All he cares about is that I pretend to believe. So he can, calm his own fears or stand high in the Jewish community or something. But he's not really even saying if you don't, he's not sincere. Because if you were sincere, you wouldn't add, and you can give back all the presents. So immediately, that went on like one beat, and I thought, no, I believe. And he resumed driving. It was never mentioned again. Now, my father was a leader of the synagogue. He was a president of the synagogue one year, and he was, attached to the Jewish religion. And we had services in our house on Fridays sometimes. But they didn't try to push religion on me. It was the framework. It was taken for granted. I did have to go to Sunday school, Jewish version of Sunday school. And I hated every minute of it. The worst was the time spent in temple. Agony in the actual ceremonies, rituals and prayers and so forth that you had to do when you got old enough. So anyway, did they walk away? If anybody had walked away from somebody, it would have been me walking away from them. I always said I brought up my parents with a strict hand. And that was only half a joke. Nobody told me what to believe in, and nobody forced me to do things or profess things or to worship them. Now, in a way, that's a testimony to them, because I think they gave me the space and the freedom to develop in that way. But I can't say what if I'd had different upbringing, whether I still would have rebelled against it. But I think so. So that's, I love telling that story because, and you can give back all the presents. Oh, no, I believe. Okay. That's it. Thank you so much for coming. And I want to tell you about one thing that's upcoming. There's a new feature on ARC UK, and Dylan, correct me if I get it wrong, but there's a group of young intellectuals called the Aporia Boys. Aporia is Greek for problems, meaning philosophical problems, who have become fascinated with objectivism and have attended our conferences, and two of them are at least maybe three of them are in the Objectivist Graduate Center or Academic Center, not yet on the graduate level. And they are starting a series on ARC UK, and their first guest is their teacher at the Objectivist Academic Center, Ankar Gate, G-H-A-T-E, Gate, who I have known for 20 or 30 years. Is a terrific guy and a really incisive, penetrating intellect in philosophy. I think it will be sensational to hear these three people talk about ideas and objectivism. Now that is at 10 p.m. UK time or 5 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. So long for now. Bye.
Before we go, Bonnie does ask, and she sent us a super chat and asked for the Bob Newhart line.
Let's see if I can remember it. gosh, I know about 200 Bob Newhart lines, and one of them went through my mind at one point. Can she remind me what we were talking about when I said that?
Yeah, 1 second here.
I didn't make a mental note of what we were talking about. I don't think it was even a salt shaker can be your doom, but that's in context, that's a very funny line.
No, she doesn't have any context.
Okay, well,
Those
we'll listen to the tape and do it in a future episode. Okay, so now I am leaving and you're leaving, and thank you for coming. Bye.